Hello, I'm Jan Szrewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. On this episode, we need to talk about the geopolitical soap opera that's currently gripping the world. Vladimir Putin's nuanced approach to peace in Ukraine. And by nuanced, I mean complicated enough to confuse even the most dedicated followers of international politics. Vladimir Putin responded to President Trump's ceasefire proposal not with a yes, not with a no, but with the diplomatic equivalent of, it's complicated. Putin claimed the proposal had nuances requiring painstaking research. Meanwhile, President Trump optimistically called Putin's non-committal stance very promising. And since we have previously said the ball was in Moscow's corner, well, now they have struck it back. But will that effort be enough to satisfy Washington in its quest for peace? Let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
Vladimir Putin has visited the Kursk region in the wake of Russian forces pushing the Ukrainians out of a key city. Kursk was, in the eyes of many, one of Kiev's most important bargaining chips at potential peace negotiations, which could be closer than ever before. The United States and Ukraine recently agreed to a ceasefire in the war. Russia's answer to it, at least their initial response, has come.
We certainly support it, but there are questions that we must discuss. I think that we need to talk about this with our American colleagues, call President Trump, discuss it together. But the idea itself of ending this conflict by peaceful means is supported by us.
What are the issues that Putin wants to discuss? His ideal ceasefire would involve an end to arms supplies and Ukrainian mobilization during the 30-day period. These terms, in reality, would significantly weaken Ukraine's defense. Putin also demanded the surrender of Ukrainian troops currently in the Kursk region, which would be a significant blow to the Ukrainian military. Observers have already pointed out that Putin's response is more of a yes but no, rather than an emphatic agreement to the US-backed proposal.
No, he put out a very promising statement, but it wasn't complete.
The ceasefire isn't the only part of the ongoing negotiations. The minerals deal between the United States and Ukraine remains a focal point, though all signs point to Kiev signing the agreement, albeit perhaps through barred teeth. It is unlikely that Ukraine will agree to Putin's conditions for a ceasefire. The question remains whether it currently has much of a choice. Talks between the United States and Russia on the matter are expected. Despite Putin's response, the ball is still in Russia's court.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been in the spotlight for the last few years, ever since his country was invaded by the Russians. Having started his career as a comedian and entertainer, he has since ascended to the status of a powerful figure in politics, praised as a hero by his allies and reviled by his enemies.
President of the European Commission.
Volodymyr Zelensky has become one of the world's most recognizable heads of state. His heroism and leadership during the Russian invasion of Ukraine has guaranteed his place in the pages of history. But before he was a war hero, before he was the president of a country of grand aspirations, he had a very unusual job. He was a comedian. For years, he did various performances for television, with his most famous role being that of a teacher who was catapulted into the Ukrainian presidency in the TV series Servant of the People. Then, in 2019, he announced his bid to run for president. Most people assumed it was a joke, a publicity stunt, especially since he named his party after the television show. And yet, Zelensky was a young candidate, an outsider with no political experience. These factors, combined with his charisma and the public's disillusionment with Ukraine's political situation, carried him to victory over incumbent Petro Poroshenko. It is no secret that Zelensky wasn't the most successful of politicians prior to 2022. But when the most difficult test of all came, he showed his quality. 3 years after that fateful day when Russian tanks rolled over the Ukrainian border, Zelensky remains a hero to his people. Even among the opposition, his leadership is not questioned, as the entire parliament recently voted unanimously in favor of his legitimacy.
And now, as always, let's examine the issue in greater detail. So, what exactly are those nuances Putin is talking about? Well, apparently, Russia is willing to stop fighting, but only if Ukraine doesn't use that time to get stronger, or if America promises to stop supplying weapons to Ukraine. Essentially, Putin is offering a ceasefire, but one so conditional that it's a bit like your friend agreeing to a diet only if pizza still counts as a vegetable. Now, Putin isn't outright rejecting the ceasefire. Instead, he's embracing the time-honored tradition of dragging negotiations out indefinitely. In fairness, Russia does currently hold some military advantages on the ground, notably in the Kursk region, which Putin is proudly emphasizing. He even made a rare appearance in military camouflage, channeling some very strange energy. Putin is ordering his military commanders to completely destroy the enemy, but then suggests he's open to discussions about peace. That's some slightly mixed messaging there. Meanwhile, Steve Witkoff, who recently secured the release of American school teacher Mark Fogel from a Russian prison, is now tasked with negotiating the ceasefire directly with Putin. Am I the only one wondering what happened to Washington's envoy for this specific issue, General Keith Kellogg? But anyhow, there is a real danger here. By drawing out negotiations, Putin gains time for Russia's military to achieve more victories, potentially weakening Ukraine's negotiating power. Russia just recaptured Sudzha, the largest town held by Ukrainian forces on Russian territory, stripping Kiev of a key bargaining chip. This strategic dragging of feet could cost thousands of lives, and Putin's demands are not just ambitious, they are maximalist in nature. Russia insists Ukraine stay out of NATO, recognize all captured lands as Russian territory, and demilitarize. That's not a peace offer, it is an invitation to unconditional surrender. Yet despite all that, President Trump remains hopeful, pushing for a quick resolution. He even hinted at discussing territorial exchanges, showing he's open to some big concessions to end the conflict. However, as optimistic as Trump seems, Putin's game isn't about quick deals. He's comfortable letting negotiations simmer, benefiting from continued military advances on the ground. Ultimately, Putin's approach isn't just about immediate victory. It's about leveraging the war's realities for a peace deal that consolidates his long-term strategic goals. This is a calculated bet, one that risks angering Washington and prolonging a bloody conflict. Putin is playing for time, Trump is pushing for quick results, and Ukraine remains caught in the deadly middle ground. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Taras Kuzio, Professor of Political Science from the National University of the Kiev Mohyla Academy. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Good morning and thank you for inviting me.
So let's begin with a quote. Vladimir Putin speaking out on the question of a potential ceasefire. The idea itself is correct and we certainly support it, but there are issues that we need to discuss. Is Putin simply prevaricating and basically preparing ground for delaying the negotiations endlessly?
Well, this is a bit of a kind of a strange situation in that it's as though Trump, Zelensky and Putin are dancing around in circles without getting to the point. I mean, anybody who follows this knows what the Russian demands have been since the spring of 2022. They have not changed at all. Russia has continued to adopt its maximalist demands, and it's not surprising, therefore, that and we shouldn't be surprised that the Kremlin came back and said, whoa, we don't agree with this ceasefire, we have our own maximalist demands. The only question we should be asking now is Donald Trump, the president of the US, going to kind of continue down his pro-Russian path and accept these Russian maximalist demands and try to impose them on Ukraine, or is the Trump administration going to try to be somewhere impartial in between Ukraine and Russia? Remember that the Trump administration has already, even before negotiations began on the ceasefire, has already said that Ukraine has agreed. Whether Ukraine was not even asked this question, but Ukraine has already agreed to not join NATO and to accept that it will not get back its 19% of its territory under Russian occupation. So Ukraine has already made these two compromises. We have never heard of the Trump administration demanding any compromises from Russia. Russia is just imposing maximalist demands. So it's a kind of a debate. It's a strange debate when we know the outcomes already. It really depends on where the Trump administration wants to go.
What do you think could be the red lines for Trump, though? Because maximalist demands that we heard from Russia in 2022, that not only included Ukraine giving away territory, Ukraine disarming, Ukraine undergoing a regime change. And of course, that was accompanied by plenty of lies from the Russian propaganda about what Ukraine really is about and what Ukrainian government wants to achieve. But also, they even had demands concerning NATO's presence on the eastern flank. Do you think that Trump would go as far as to accede to those demands as well?
Well, Russia, if we go back a bit, yes, in December of 2021, Russia issued two kind of draft treaties, which NATO and Western countries at that time believed were de facto Russian kind of maximalist demands that NATO should reverse its enlargement eastwards back to what it was like in 1997. This, of course, will never happen. I mean, the idea that somehow all the new members of NATO are going to say, okay, yes, we now withdraw from NATO is obviously ridiculous. It's not going to happen.
What about U.S. military presence, though?
Well, I mean, then that's a kind of a separate but related question that will NATO survive if the Trump administration is no longer interested in it? Well, it could survive as just a European plus Canadian structure. Maybe then that it will allow Ukraine in. Whether the United States will continue to be supportive of NATO is something we don't know at this point in time. But the idea that NATO members will kind of withdraw and accept this Russian demand is simply ludicrous. And especially now, because those Central Eastern European, Scandinavian and Baltic members of NATO see Russia as an even greater threat than they saw it in 2021. And all of these other demands that Russia continues to make were made in the spring of 2022, which are that, I mean, there were literally about 3 or 4 pages of Ukraine legislation on culture, education, language, memory politics, decommunization, the religious question. All of these had to be changed by Ukrainian side. This was the Russian demand. This is when they talk about the root causes that have to be eliminated from the war. It refers to this kind of legislation which reinforces a Ukrainian identity separate to Russian. They want Ukraine to become a little Russia, a kind of a Lukashenko Belarus number 2. And of course, this hasn't changed. And I don't see how this can actually take place, even if the Americans try to impose this on Ukrainians. Ukrainians are not going to put their hands up and say, yes, now we're all little Russians. Sorry about that. It's simply not going to happen. And even if Zelensky tried to push this forward, which I don't think he would, there would be a third Euromaidan revolution.
And also, there are signals that the US would support elections in Ukraine, except judging by the potential candidates, and it has to be added that all serious Ukrainian candidates are saying we don't want elections right now because it is illegal, we have a war going on. But the most substantial candidates, one could say, the ones with the most substantial support, they wouldn't necessarily be more pliant to these demands. I mean, Valery Zaluzhny, who never said that he would run, but he is viewed as a potential future president, doesn't look like a man who would simply put his hands up in the air and say, okay, we surrender. Certainly he does not. So do you think there is a risk, though, that Russia might try to use some sort of underhand method to try and install some Kremlin-friendly candidates somehow, even though I can't see how Ukrainian people would ever support such a guy?
Yeah, I mean, the only way that a pro-Russian candidate could have been imposed on Ukraine back in 2022 or today is by Russian military imposing a dictator. In an election, that would never happen because pro-Russian political forces are now completely marginalized. I mean, there's simply no support. What this full-scale war has done is brought Eastern and Southern Ukrainian Russian speakers to the same viewpoint as Western and Central Ukrainians. They're as anti-Russian as Western Ukrainians. The idea that a pro-Russian candidate would win a free election in Ukraine is simply ridiculous. First of all, there are none of those candidates. And then you're absolutely right that an election now would be impossible under the Constitution, just as it was impossible in Great Britain during World War II. They didn't have an election for 10 years. This is all to do with Trump's personal vindictiveness against Zelensky, going back to his first impeachment in 2019, 2020. And what Trump's kind of arrogance and rhetoric has done, not only in Ukraine, but also in Canada and in other countries, including in Britain, by the way, is that it's boosted politicians whose popularity was in decline. So in Canada, Liberal Party is now rising. When they were about to lose the elections, they're now far more popular than Conservatives. In Ukraine, Zelensky's ratings have gone up since his disagreements with Trump. And the same in Britain with the Labour Party leader. His ratings have gone up. So
the reverse effect, actually, that we're seeing there. But let's also talk about the possible leverages on Moscow, because we did have reports about certain restrictions on the sanctions imposed on Russian banks, which made it possible to purchase oil in Europe. These have not been renewed. So that's effectively a way of reinforcing the existing sanctions. Do you think that the Trump administration might, in the end, see that Putin is playing for time and say, okay, so we gave you a proposal for a ceasefire, Ukraine agreed to it, you're trying to simply make us wait forever, so we're going to reinforce the existing sanctions and impose new ones. Can you actually see this happening?
Yes, it's possible, because Trump is in a rush. He has this idea that he's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, and he's in a rush. So he doesn't care about the process. He cares about the end result, as it were. Whereas Putin is the opposite. He wants to drag this out, make demands, flatter Trump, and kind of get his own way that way. And so I think there is a potential here for a clash between the Trump and Putin approaches to this, certainly. And the only way that the Trump administration can kind of try to apply pressure on Russia is militarily and through energy policy. As you've mentioned, it's now any country that now buys oil from Russia will have secondary sanctions imposed upon it by the US. And that's going to deter even potentially Russia and China from buying Russian oil. So that's
some commentators say this is like the most powerful deterrent. Secondary sanctions would be devastating for Russia.
Yes, it potentially would. But I mean, the EU and NATO and the United States could double up on that by blockading Russian, these so-called shadow fleet, leaving ports in the Baltic Sea, because most of Russia's oil is exported through the Baltic Sea. And Russia is it's a country that depends completely, practically, on for its budget on the export of oil and gas. And if that goes down, that could have a major impact. Plus, of course, American weapons, more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine without restrictions on firing them inside Russia could also apply pressure. But let's not be too overconfident. For Putin, this is an existential war. He wants to go down into history as a great Russian leader like Peter the Great and Stalin. And so if he doesn't kind of have a victory in this so-called special military operation, it's over for Putin. It's over. There's already criticism coming to him from the nationalists, these bloggers and nationalist veterans. There's a huge number of veterans. They're all asking, well, if we give up now, why was there a need for nearly 1 million Russians to die in this war? So Putin's in a difficult position. It's just, I hope that the Trump team understands that and works that to the benefits of a peace deal, I'm not so sure the Trump team understand all these questions.
So these are some very important issues that will be, of course, bringing you more as they unfold as time goes by. For the time being, Taras Kuzio was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you for inviting me.
And now, moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Russia has expanded its entry ban on European officials, activists and scientists. The move comes in response to the European Union's latest sanctions on Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine.
In a tit-for-tat move, the Russian Foreign Ministry said it was significantly expanding its list of travel bans on various EU individuals. The announcement did not include a list of names or the number of people affected by this decision. Moscow's move also affects persons engaged in prosecuting Russian officials, promoting the establishment of a tribunal to try Russian leadership, and those who back ideas to seize Russian state assets to support Ukraine's cause. The EU's most recent package of sanctions against Russia was introduced on the third anniversary of the war in Ukraine. The 16th set of sanctions focused on hitting Russia's so-called shadow fleet of ships used by Moscow to bypass Western oil restrictions. It also concerned banks which help evade said sanctions, media outlets which broadcast in EU territory, and gaming consoles which could possibly be repurposed as drones. The package also included measures against Russian aluminum imports. Since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the European Union has sanctioned more than 2,000 officials and entities.
Hungary has demanded that sanctions be waived on Russian billionaire Mikhail Friedman, according to anonymous officials cited by the Financial Times. This is a condition for Hungary to support the extension of EU sanctions imposed on Russia.
The report on Hungary's latest demands has confirmed some of the investigations from February into Budapest pushing to lift the sanctions on Friedman and 6 other Russian billionaires and 1 federal minister. Now apparently Hungary has dropped some of its demands but continues to insist on Friedman's exclusion from the sanctions list. Luxembourg reportedly also supports Hungary's bid. The billionaire had filed a lawsuit against Luxembourg last year, seeking billions in sanctions-related damages. Friedman and one of his business partners, Petr Aven, also successfully challenged an EU court last year to at least partially annul sanctions related to Ukraine. He is also contesting other EU measures which classify him and the business partner as businesspersons in a sector which provide revenue to the Kremlin. The European Union has to renew 2 sets of the sanctions it has imposed on Russia every 6 months via unanimous vote. Hungary, which has not distanced itself from Moscow as much as many other of the bloc's members, has used its vote in the renewal process as political leverage.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.